In order to engage in the discussion about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, we need to first understand the emissions trends, both from a historical perspective and based on current data. Historically, developed countries have been responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions increases that the world has experienced since the Industrial Revolution. This map, provided by the World Resources Institute, CAIT Climate Data Explorer, shows that in the 1850s, the United Kingdom was by far the top emitter of carbon dioxide, followed by the United States, France, Germany, and Belgium. Industrializing countries continued to increase their emissions, and by the 1960s, the United States became the top emitter, and by the 1970s, developed countries were responsible for approximately 2/3 of global emissions. This trend, however, changed dramatically by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Remember that the UNFCCC divided its member states into Annex I, industrialized nations, and non-Annex I, developing nations? Well, this graph compares the greenhouse gas emissions from Annex I and non-Annex I regions. In 2013, the developed countries accounted for approximately 40% of global emissions, while the developing countries emitted 60% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. At the forefront of this increase are China and India, countries that are currently at a stage of industrial development that is highly energy intensive. China alone is currently responsible for 60% of the global coal consumed in industry. This map by the World Resources Institute illustrates China's emissions in 2011. In 2012, the 6 largest CO2 emitters from fossil fuel use and cement production were China, the US, the European Union as a single entity, India, the Russian Federation, and Japan. China's emissions growth levels since 2000 are larger than the total level of emissions in 2012 of the other BRICS countries combined. Emissions in developing countries have been increasing at about 8 times faster than those in the developed countries, and the developing countries are projected to contribute approximately 70% of the global business-as-usual emissions by 2030. So, despite recent emissions reductions efforts by some important developed countries, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. And now I will add another factor to this analysis which will make things a bit more complex. We have been discussing the overall emissions by countries, but what about emissions per capita? As of December 2017, the global human population is 7.6 billion people, most of which rely on fossil fuels in their everyday lives. Some might argue that the fair way of looking at emissions is by comparing per capita emissions rather than overall emissions. Looking at regions, North America still has the largest per capita emissions, followed by Oceania, Europe, and then Asia. The United States per capita emissions have decreased with the outsourcing of manufacturing capacity to China. But while China's average per capita emissions have tripled between 1990 and 2011, it still remains at a low level comparatively to the US. To conclude, the international community eventually realized that in order to stabilize the global temperature increase at well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, all the highest emitters, including the developed countries and transitional developing countries such as China, India, and Brazil, must contribute. And in the Paris Agreement, that historical divide between responsibilities of developed and developing countries that was embedded in the Kyoto Protocol was abandoned. But we will get back to this when we discuss the Paris Agreement in more detail.